The same old discussions and problems remain. So what's to be done? Let's get started.
Another race for the world's greatest driver, Juan Manuel Fangio.
Former world champion Jim Clark leapt into the lead. That's Clark's Lotus going like a bomb.
And James Hunt is the world champion by just one single point.
By being a racing driver, you are under risks all the time. And if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver.
And that is Michael Schumacher ahead, the world champion.
To become a four-time world champion, Sebastian Vettel, Lewis Hamilton, champion of the world.
That's for all the kids out there who dream the impossible.
Max Verstappen, for the first time ever, is champion of the world.
Oh my God! Max Verstappen, you are the world champion! The world champion!
Hello and welcome to a rather warm episode 21 of F1 in Review, the episode, the hour and part 2 where we look back at round 11 of this season, the Austrian Grand Prix, and forwards to the French Grand Prix coming up this weekend. Hello, I'm Tom Clabon, and as ever I'm joined by Tristan Fancourt and Angus Gallager. A reminder, you can follow myself and Tristan individually on Twitter, as well as F1 in Review. We have our own account there as well. And unfortunately we start this episode on a more negative, unpleasant topic. As many of you may have seen and heard, Aidan Liu, who previously worked as a laminator at Aston Martin until very recently, indeed he helped to build Sebastian Vettel's cars, been telling Sky Sports and indeed the world that he was repeatedly subjected to racist and homophobic abuse when at the team, and was referred to by racial slurs and not his name by other members of the team. Now, Aston Martin say that Aidan's contract was terminated due to poor performance and poor timekeeping and was unconnected to the discrimination he experienced. And going on to say more about this, they say AMR and its suppliers operate a zero-tolerance policy with regards to racism, homophobia and all types of discrimination. In this case, the complaint was rightly believed and his complaints were immediately acted upon and appropriate sanctions were imposed in line with our zero-tolerance policy regarding this. We are in ongoing discussions with him regarding this. Formula One are yet to comment on this. They have been approached on this, and as of the time of recording, that being Monday evening, there's been nothing from them. So here we are again, aren't we? Despite the public campaigns, the promises, the slogans, we race as one, end racism, the gestures and the like, it seems that at the very least in some pockets of Formula One, or hopefully not the entirety of the sport, there seems to be still a problem with racism. Our thoughts on this?
Well, the only thought that I have is consistent with my previous lines on this, which is it needs to absolutely be stamped out. And this isn't just a criticism of Aston Martin. This is deeper than that. It's rooted within the fan base and within the teams themselves, and goes beyond just what we're seeing in the UK, but actually is reflective of the fact that F1 has a problem with the kind of people it deals with. For example, I don't know if you saw today that Aston Martin raised £650 million from Saudi Arabia as it takes a stake in the company. And they asked Papa Stroll, as we like to call him, or Lawrence Stroll, who basically owns Aston Martin, leads the conglomerate, owns it, whether or not he was comfortable with the Saudi Arabia getting involved, given their human rights record. And he said, yes, I'm very comfortable. Bear in mind that they actually invest in other companies, such as McLaren. And so when we're talking about the inbuilt racism, sexism, homophobia, challenge to human rights, which is all involved in the sport, the only thing I can think of is that we need to get rid of it. And that means terminating partnerships with people like Aramco, making sure that fans that are racist are gone. Now, I will say that Aston Martin, it's important to point this out, Aston Martin did let go of those employees who were racist, have been let go. So that's good. But the fact is, they felt like they were comfortable enough to behave like that. And that's worrying, because it means that they were happy to be heard, to be on CCTV. This isn't stuff they're saying quietly, in a corner where no one can hear them. But this is something they can say in a really public forum, and they don't really care who overhears. which is incredibly embarrassing for Aston Martin and probably, reflective of the kind of culture that they've been building there. And it's a real shame. But as I say, this goes beyond just the surface level homophobia, racism, everything that we see because it gets reported, because someone speaks out. The reality is we need to get rid of the ties to people who have, who challenge the values that we hold dear. There's no point saying things like "we race as one" if you're not going to actually support that with any real actions, because there can be positive actions that can come from teams. At the end of the day, we have to, for example, get women into the sport. So when Alpine have launched their program to get a female racer into Formula 1, that's really good. Those are actions. But the fact is, F1 has a massive problem with actually getting some actions behind its words. So we do have a culture where we think it's acceptable, apparently, to be racist, to be homophobic, to just at the last Grand Prix, there was those people that felt it was acceptable to belittle and sexually abuse those women. And we as fans have to stand up against that. If you see it, you have to call it out. And Formula 1, well, they need to actually get off their arses and do something about it as well.
Yeah, completely echo those words, Tristan, honestly. It's just... It's one of those where... The thing with the news, it's very easy to... I always try to look at these news stories from the other point of view, in that whilst there's been an instance of racism and homophobia at this Formula 1 team, and you immediately have to think, well, not everybody is like that, not everybody is homophobic and racist. You just have these idiotic, brainless minorities who display this disgusting behaviour, and it's the kind of behaviour, again, where you think, well, would this happen if they weren't in a group of people, if they're not in front of their mates? Or is this just something which is just intrinsic within them, that they are brought up with and that they are just comfortable saying out loud, which I cannot, I don't understand what would bring you to the point of thinking that would be acceptable. But some people are still learning, it seems, and they're going to be learning the hard way. And it's good to see that Aston Martin have actioned this by terminating their contracts, making sure those people don't work for the team. I raised this point in our group chat a few days ago when the story came out about the generic statement that Aston Martin trotted out, saying we, in all regards, do not tolerate any of this behaviour. Now, of course, I'm sure that's genuine and they mean that, but it just seems like such a generic point of view, like PR stuff that they put out there after an instance happened. Just to, basically, a common strategy, it seems, of organisations in this modern world is to see something horrendous happen in their organisation, deal with it, and then go, we stand for the complete opposite. Promise. Which I'm sure Aston Martin does, but events like this just makes it seem like they're being a bit more lackadaisical on the issue and not clamping down properly. I must also say it's positive. It's not positive at all that poor Aidan has had to go through this. I would say it is very positive that he has felt comfortable enough or has come and spoken out about it. It's really important that these things are put in the public eye and that we hear about them so that we're aware of them. And if we're aware if you're aware things are going on, you're in a much better position to tackle them. So I give him huge credit for coming out and talking about his experience, an experience which must have been horrible to go through. So that's really really positive. Also, the interesting juxtaposition between to comment on the other topic you raised of Aston Martin raking in millions and millions of pounds from a largely questionable regime, whilst Alpine also launches their initiative to get more women into the sport. That is chalk and cheese. Absolute chalk and cheese in terms of actions you can take to try and further the development and increase the interest of not marginalised groups, but groups which are, in terms of Formula 1, marginalised in terms of who works there. So Alpine doing absolutely the right thing. It's incredible how they're reaching out and trying to get more women into the sport in what is still a male-dominated F1 paddock, Whilst Aston Martin on the other side look at Saudi Arabia and go, you know what, I want a slice of that pie. I don't mind the £650 million that's coming in, despite the morally questionable things that come out of them. Sebastian Vettel must be absolutely quaking in his boots. If I was him, I would not have a chance or consider any chance of myself renewing a contract to his team for the future, because that is Aston Martin's more and more looking like the kind of team, partly through their own creation, sometimes through no fault of their own, a team which you don't want to be around. And we'll come to on-track matters later on, but in terms of what's happened off-track, this story that's been raised by young Aiden is one which shows that, yes, Aston Martin in particular, perhaps Formula One as a whole, still has a lot to learn when it comes to its attitude towards accepting and embracing all groups within our sport.
Yeah, I definitely agree. There is work to be done, and unfortunately, cases like this show that in many cases, despite the nice slogans, we've hardly scratched the surface of what is a mentality problem and a cultural problem within Formula One. I don't think we should, kid ourselves in thinking that we could one day wake up where we don't have questionable regimes and questionable companies from questionable regimes involved in the sport, but we can at least control what we can. I think the personnel within Formula One, many of them, unfortunately, still do see the sport as theirs, and they don't see the sport as being the property of others, shall we say. And I'm not too sure where that necessarily comes from. Maybe that comes from the fact that Formula One has, in the past, and still does, attract and foster those who have lots of money versus talent, and is not necessarily the most meritocratic system going on. But that needs to get weeded out, really, and is now upon all teams and the FIA and Formula One and drivers stomping their feet to say, well, this isn't good enough, because if we're not careful, there'll be the classic sort of rise of, we've got to go and do something, we've got to be seen as doing something, let's do stuff that sort of teeter around the edges of the issue but not go up the core, but then the core still remains. Everyone goes, well, we've made lots of noises about homophobia and racism and going against people based on who they are, not based on what they can actually do for the sport, and then they go, okay, well, we've solved the issue type thing, and then it goes away. But I'm yet to see serious, coordinated, tangible action from Formula One about tackling this issue. It seems to be, as we say, based very much on what they're seen to be doing rather than what they're actually doing in many cases. So they need to show that they care and not just be of the opinion that, well, we care enough if other people care, but we don't really care, because, as Aidan said in many times to Sky Sports and others, we're all told that it's a level playing field, get involved with the sport, if you love something, go after it, that type of thing. But if that's not the case, and if Formula One still has barriers up against certain people it doesn't like and wants to conserve itself or the old system of it, then that's really to the sport's detriment, because we've seen, haven't we, not only with series like Drive to Survive and others, when you open the gates in many cases to a wider section of society and the community and introduce them to something, they will probably like it, and that will probably be to the betterment of it, as long as it's controlled and regulated in terms of safety, as we alluded to last episode. But that's the thing, really. You've got to think, do Formula One and do large proponents of it want the goods and the resources that comes from better, more people getting involved in it, viewing it, being a part of it, but aren't willing really to change some of the nastier sides of it? And there's work to be done, and time will tell whether they're serious about changing the darker sides of it. But we'll see.
It's so difficult because Formula One needs money, and the sport is an incredibly expensive one. Just logistics are on another level when it comes to moving the paddocks around the globe in, frankly, a very inefficient manner if you actually look at the calendar. The cars are worth hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars, whatever respective currency you would like, and that's not just necessarily the manufacturing, but also the R&D and the designing. And then on top of that, you've got to pay for everything else that goes along with it, like the wind tunnel time. You've got to rent tracks. You've got to do so much, and before you know it, you've got to raise billions to get this thing going. That's why Aston Martin needs the cash injection from Saudi Arabia, and not just for their Formula One car, but for their road cars as well, because it's all interlinked. Ferrari needs hundreds of millions to get going, and that's the problem, because Formula One is a money pit, then it attracts, unfortunately, the wealthiest in the world, which unfortunately comes from exploitation. And we've got to move away from signing up just the highest bidder. And yes, it's going to be a slow process. I don't think any one of us can say, absolutely, we're going to be able to get rid of, Ramco, Shell, or BP, or whoever, Exco, immediately. But we've got to start not only transitioning the sport away from excess, and that's why the budget cap and stuff has come in. But we've also got to start transitioning the kind of companies that Formula One deals with as well to ones that are more reputable, and the teams have to take responsibility for that, because if the sport doesn't fit with the new world, and at the moment I don't think it does, then we're going to have a major problem, because something will have to give. And it's good to hear that things like the calendar is going to be more efficient, so that all of Europe's dealt with in one go, North America's dealt with one go, for example, Asia is all dealt with sort of in one go, so that you don't have to keep shipping things around. But those are really big things. But F1 could deal with the very, very small things immediately, such as stopping the racism, stopping the acceptable culture of homophobia, or the fact that fans feel comfortable sexually assaulting women. Those are things that you can stop now. You might not be able to completely separate Aramco and the oil companies from Formula One, but they can take action that means something to so many people immediately. Not just, as you say, Angus, publishing generic pre-written statements, that sort of stuff, that useless stuff. They can actually make a difference to people's perception of the sport and the fan culture by having zero tolerance policies, by preventing excess drinking, for example, and gang and herd nature within the crowds. And I think if they started with the little things, then we could actually transition the sport quickly to a point where we're quite proud of the things that F1 is doing. I'm sick and tired of having to yet again discuss the fact that the fans or a team or F1 themselves embarrassing us yet again. It would be nice one day to say, good, F1's banned 60 fans that were inappropriate at a site, and made sure that they're never getting back into the paddock again, so that people will feel safer. Those are the stories we want to report on. And yet again, it seems that F1 is embarrassing itself by accepting a culture that is just a juxtaposition to the kind of morals and things that we, F1 in Review, and I think the majority of F1 fans, hold dear.
And as we say, going on to Aston Martin on track, they've only scored points 7 times out of the 11 races we've had in terms of this Formula One season. We heard at the start from their team principal, they were looking to be title contenders. There's someone like Sebastian Vettel there who would bring expertise, knowledge and experience. But currently they're 9th in the Constructors. They're only 15 points ahead of Williams. They're 9 points behind AlphaTauri, which, let's be fair, have been stuttering and spluttering themselves. And they're nearly half the points that Haas have, with their 35 for Haas and 18 for Aston Martin. It's not been a great start for Aston Martin, although we are sort of nearly halfway there. There is time for them to repair what's been a poor start. But what do we make of their performances so far?
Rubbish. They're their performances have really left Aston Martin fans lacking, you could say. And it's not even, you made the point about them talking about title contenders, or them being title contenders, Tom. It's an interesting one, because I think even the most optimistic Aston Martin fan wouldn't have expected them to be title contenders this year, even with a rule change. I think that statement they put out there is more like a 4-5 year plan, so to speak. They've come back, they've re-entered the sport after a very long time out, as in when they used to be an engine manufacturer compared to now having a team. And they're slowly investing, they're bringing talent on board, bringing Martin Whitmarsh on board in a team role, or a high up team role there, as seen as a sign of them building their stocks, so to speak, investing in a new factory as well, bringing in money, rightly or wrongly, through the sponsorship they've acquired. It seems like a building process, building towards something, having a goal, to be world champions in 4 or 5 years. But this year, I think we at least expected them, after a year last year where they came, 7th? Yeah, 7th in the Constructors' Championship, I think. Sort of in that midfield pack. You thought, you know what, they ought to make a step forward this year, almost be like where McLaren and Alpine are right now, sort of on their day as close to Mercedes or on Mercedes' pace, but not as far down as they are at the moment. They're constantly, regularly getting knocked out. Both cars in Q1, like last 2-3 races in a row. We're getting used to the deja vu of Sebastian Vettel's engineer tell him, Seb, mate, you're out in Q1, and he goes, you're joking, you're kidding me, every single time. So that's not what he wants to hear. It's not what Aston Martin fans want to hear. But it's the truth at the moment. They have a mixture of a Mercedes engine which is just not as good as the other ones on the grid at the moment. That's just a fact. They have a car design which last year their car design was less beneficial because it was the high rake versus low rake system. So Aston Martin and Mercedes, two teams who went for a low rake design, which turned out to be not beneficial in terms of the slightly adjusted regulations last year. This year they just seem to have gone down the wrong route in terms of the brand new regulations with the completely redesigned cars. And it's just all not going very well. There's not much to be positive about. You've got a 4-time world champion who is openly questioning his place in the sport and having a public meltdown about whether Formula 1 is destroying the environment. The fact that he's gained more notoriety this year for going on Question Time in the UK rather than any of his Formula 1 performances speaks volumes, in my opinion. I can't think of an occasion, and looking at the results here, I can't think of an occasion where you thought, oh, that's a good weekend for Aston Martin. That was a good weekend. I can't think of one. Vettel came 6th in Baku, which is their only top 7 finish so far this year for either driver. Now, that was a very good weekend for sure, and he is a Baku specialist. But even that weekend, I don't recall it being like, oh, you know what, Aston Martin are quick this weekend. He probably had a very good weekend for sure, as shown by that final result. But it wasn't a case of, oh, Aston Martin are back. They've got their pace advantage again. It just seems like a flash in the pan, really, that weekend, because they've just been not threatening at all the midfield, not threatening Q2, not threatening Q3 or sometimes Q2. It just looks very bleak for them. And of course, there's the old argument of they've reached such a low point that the only way is up. But if they could find themselves in a situation where, their 4-time world champion, their star driver, has enough, he goes off. He's been linked with McLaren in recent weeks, and he may see either a better future there or outside the sport altogether. And then you're left with a vacant seat, and then the son of the team boss, who is underperforming and also looks like he'll never be shifted because he's the son of the team boss. So it's not really an ideal set of scenarios that they currently find themselves in. And that continued in Austria. Poor performance. Vettel got punted out a couple of times. There's not much more to say, really. They're just in the doldrums, really.
They are, and it's a shame because I feel like Aston Martin, and I guess the last generation of the Racing Point car, when it was not quite as good either, sort of squandered the kind of team that they bought. Because before Lawrence Stroll, as we call him, Papa Stroll, his son Lance Stroll is the driver. They've got kind of similar names, so it's okay if you get them confused. Before Lawrence Stroll took over the team, it was Force India, and Force India, well, it kind of punched above its weight, let's say, in the hybrid era. We would see pretty good results for a team that had a small budget. It was, I guess, it was like the real underdog of Formula One, and then their funding went, and so they had to get a new funder, and that came from in a lovely form of Lawrence Stroll, and he took over the team, and it kind of continued to punch above its weight a bit. They had good drivers, in Sergio Perez and Ocon, even though they tried to kill each other a few times by ramming each other off the track, but they kind of had a fighting spirit, And then I would say it kind of went downhill when Lawrence Stroll decided to get Lance Stroll a seat, and we had that competition between Sergio Perez and Esteban Ocon about which one was going to keep their seat. And in the end, Ocon got given the boot. And as soon as he did that, as soon as Lawrence Stroll did that, I feel like he put the team on a very specific trajectory, which unfortunately meant that they started to slip. And instead of, I say, nurturing this team that was punching above its weight, they kind of just lost all the momentum behind it, and now it's basically turned into Team Lance Stroll tried to get him around the track as quickly as possible, and oh yes, there's his mentor in the form of Sebastian Vettel. And Sebastian Vettel, after the last race, said that it was time to consider his future and weigh up whether or not he wants to spend time with his family. And sentiments like that are indicative of a driver that doesn't want to be in the sport anymore. And that's reflective, I think, in how he's doing within the championship. I mean, just look at both the drivers. He's like in the last race, Lance Stroll finished in 13th and Sebastian Vettel in 17th. That's stone dead last, and those sort of results have just been very, very consistent. Even at their home race at the British Grand Prix, Lance Stroll was in 11th. And Sebastian Vettel managed to get up into the points into 9th place. But this isn't a team that has great momentum. I feel like they've got a pretty terrible car because they keep changing it. Don't forget that this is their next spec car. They started off with a car that looked kind of different to everyone else's. And then they decided to just basically copy the Red Bull car. Or, they say they didn't, but perhaps take inspiration from, but they ended up then producing another car completely that looks a bit more like Red Bull, and it's just not performing. The only thing that's performing is currently the strategy team within the Aston Martin racing team, because they know that the car looks after the tyres, and so their strategy basically has been run both drivers long, and then hope there's a safety car or something happens, so that basically they can overcut everyone else because they've got a time deficit. And that's not a strategy of a winning team. That's a strategy of a team that is just hoping for the best in the worst possible way. So I feel like for Aston Martin, they need to have picked a car. I can't think of any team that's just completely re-engineered a car, thirds of the way through a season and thought, yep, that's the way we're going to win. It's all about creating a good package at the beginning and building upon that. And, yes, you can add in new things. Like, let's not forget that things like the double diffuser for many teams, way back when it was Button who won the championship, the double diffuser was so disruptive that other teams engineered it into their cars. But none of them decided to completely re-engineer their cars. Aston Martin is just doing some weird things at the moment, and to be honest, I'm not surprised it's not paying off. But the strategy team, I think, is the only reason why the team has any points.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. And I remember the start of the season when we had the sponsor, BWT, leaving, going to Alpine. You had the team principal that was of Aston Martin / Racing Points. On myself now going to Alpine as well, there were warning signs there. There was, clear issues that things weren't well, and you thought, well, okay, there's reasons why people move on. BWT aren't the be all and end all. No pun intended there. It's all good. They've got Aramco there as a sponsor. There's money behind them. They've got somebody in Mike Crack who's obviously had great experience when it comes to motorsport, so there's in good hands there. They've got Sebastian Vettel with a lot of experience. It's all going to be okay, but it just hasn't been, has it? And I think they've lost their sort of punchiness, their edge that Racing Point and Formula Force India had, as we've been talking about there. And now, in many ways, I have more faith in someone like Alex Albon to just spring something out there and to get some points. And looking at it from a purely maths perspective, that's completely false. He's only got points twice compared to the Aston Martin team that have got points so many times. A double points finish, as well as we look all the way back to Imola, for example, this season. But so far, aside from a few occasions where they've done reasonably well, it just doesn't look good, does it? I mean, as well, you see Sebastian Vettel with someone who has a contract running out at the end of the season, and you think, well, where do they go from here? They seem to be very directionless. And as you say, that stems from prioritising Lawrence Stroll over the team. And rewind a few seasons when you had him fighting for a win, if you can believe it or not, at Turkey, getting consistent points with a Racing Point car. You thought, well, maybe we were wrong about him. Maybe we were harsh and thought, well, okay, he's gone into the sport owing to money, not owing to talent. But the more we see of him, the clearer it is that Lance Stroll just isn't the man to do the job and to get Aston Martin up the grid and be the title contenders they say they want to be in many years' time. So it begs the question, where does that cut-off point come? Where does the tension get released between the ambitions of someone like Mike Crack, who wants to go and get them up to be contenders, so he says, I believe him, and then Lawrence Stroll saying, well, I want that as well, but that's got to be with my son in the car. The two aren't going to be compatible, are they? So it begs the question, what happens there? And someone like Sebastian Vettel as well. You hear comments of him saying, I'm not happy, I want to be racing in cars that can win races. A clear shot, really, of where Aston are at the moment. And I think, really, the problem is that if you have someone like Sebastian Vettel leaving, if you have, the demotion of Hulkenberg, you have someone like Ocon being turfed out because he's not the man for the job, someone like Perez turfed out because he's not the man for the job, that sends out the wrong signals to any other driver that wants to come potentially to Aston Martin or sees a vacancy there in a few years' time, because they think, well, I could get a seat there. It could be a nice ride for 1, 2, maybe 3 years. But then when I'm surplus to requirements, when Lance or Lawrence Stroll doesn't fancy me anymore, I'm out. I've got to start all over again. And you think to yourself, how sustainable is that for Aston Martin, who want to be title contenders? Not really, is it? Because then you become the meme team of, I won't go there because give it 2 seasons, you'll be out, pal, whoever you are. And it's not great foundations or anything really to build success on. So they really are the masters in many cases of their own downfall, because yes, Lawrence Stroll is bringing so much money into the team, obviously keeping them afloat after they got into financial difficulties with a previous owner, but there doesn't seem to be a plan or a realistic plan moving forwards about what Aston Martin want to be. And we've seen in the lower midfield teams like Haas, for example, AlphaTauri and other aspects as well, they all seem to have plans about where they want to go. Haas, for example, gambled with 2 younger drivers, got a lot of money in, accepted their losses for last season, thought, this season is going to be the one. That's paying off in some aspects. AlphaTauri, let's go for a name change, get some more sponsorship in, depict ourselves at the very least as being more a sister team than a feeder team to Red Bull. Obviously, there's question marks about how true that is, but once again, a plan. Alfa Romeo, bring Bottas in, get rid of Giovinazzi and Raikkonen. A plan that's working. And obviously, not everyone can have a plan that works. That's how Formula One and life is to an extent. But at least you can see the logic of it, and you can see the sort of general trajectory of it and the direction, and clear pieces to the puzzle. What I'm seeing now with Aston Martin is, we want to be title contenders, let's put some money into various different factories and into the development of this, that and the other, but nothing seems to be ringing true. So I think really, if Aston Martin want to get serious with themselves, they've got to get back to the drawing board come summer break, come the end of the season, and go, well, this, whatever this is, isn't working, it's time to do something different.
I wonder, Aston Martin fans out there, and I know there are some because I see them in the wild. When you look at your team, and I suppose it's similar as a McLaren fan, I see that and I feel sad. When you see the team, how do you feel about Lance Stroll being the de facto number 1 driver? I'd like to know whether or not you feel that they should cut their losses, get rid of Lance, and that might jeopardise the funding, or whether or not you feel that they should keep going with the hope that they'll get a second driver once Vettel is gone. They'll be able to pick up the reins and get performance. Because it must be difficult watching a team that has so much potential and so much money backing it, including this new £650 million from the Saudi Arabia State Investment Group. It must be really difficult seeing no results come through, because something, as you say, Tom, has definitely got to change there. Because it just feels a bit like, McLaren at the moment as well, kind of kind of got no direction. Nothing really coming out of all the investment, all the hype that we hear from them.
Sprint.
Yeah, sprint.
Cool.
We're sprinting through these topics.
Hey, banter.
Drop my
Hey, oh, hang on. Oh dear. Right, okay. So yes, we had our second sprint race of the season on Saturday in Austria just gone, and this is the second of 3 that we'll have. The last one will be in Brazil, and I think really looking at the entirety of the sprint race, I think Alpine trying to get Alonso to start with tyre blankets on, Zhou failing to get to the grid itself were probably the main highlights of the sprint, and for the eagle-eye viewer out there, you'll know that's before the sprint even began. It saw Max Verstappen qualifying P1 and hold that all the way to the start for Sunday, but aside from Sergio Perez getting all the way from P13 to P5, it didn't really shake up the grid too much from P1 to 4, or indeed from 5 to 10 and beyond. And it saw Ferrari scrapping quite ferociously at the start of this sprint for P2 and 3, very much to their own detriment. So older listeners will know our thoughts on the sprints. With 2 sprints down, have those views changed? Have they solidified? Where are we in our complicated relationship with the sprint?
Well, Tom, as you say, older listeners and I would say listeners who've heard our podcast for a couple of years now will know that Angus is very much anti-sprint. I seem to be slightly more kind to the format, but Tom, you've always remained a little bit more on the fence. So, now that the sprint is a bit more mature, we're into the second season of experiencing it. I ask you, what as a sort of an on the fence spectator of the sprint, do you think it's adding anything to the sport? Do you think it needs adjustment? How would you fix it if you think it did?
Yeah, interesting. I think I've always been down, or I've tried to be down at least, as a sprint skeptic, i.e. give it time, but if it doesn't work out, it's got to go. And I think a lot of the same problems still remain when it comes to the sprint. First of all, the points tally just aren't enough to go and warrant teams to really go all in, put, 2-footer challenges in, if you're going to go for a football analogy, in terms of the sprint, because the cost of damaging one's car ahead of Saturday is just too great to go for a lunging move here or a daring move on the outside. So that's got to change. It still isn't a sprint. 15 laps or so is not a sprint. 20 laps isn't a sprint. A sprint, in my view, is literally 5 laps at the very most, or 7 maybe, but it's got to at least be below double figures for it to be a sprint, because otherwise it's just a semi-marathon or a relay in my view. So I would give the sprint one more chance. I would give the sprint at the very push one more season, but I wouldn't give it more than 3 races really, or I wouldn't go far beyond that, because I've always been a fan of the old qualifying system. I think it's allowed teams that shouldn't ordinarily be on the 3rd or 2nd, 4th row of the grid to get there really by getting strategy right, by going out early, by putting different tyres on in variable conditions. And my issue with the sprint is you have that in final practice or qualifying, whatever, but then it just waters it down, and eventually you get the better teams going out on top. And of course, talent must prevail in many aspects. I totally get that argument. But one of the reasons we love Formula 1 is because it throws up some of the weird and wonderful aspects. Stroll starting P1, for example, in Turkey way back when. No one would have thought about that. That would have been watered down. That would have been non-existent by the sprint, because the race pace of the other cars around what was then a racing point would have destroyed it. And the danger is with the sprint, you put too much emphasis on race pace versus qualifying pace, and of course that must always dominate in one aspect. But there's always got to be the day where the teams that qualify well get their day in the sun. Ferrari, I remember last season, had excellent qualifying pace, got onto the front row of the grid many occasions, but race pace didn't prevail. But that's fine, because there was a race for the race to get rid of that, and for the race pace to qualify, or to supersede the qualifying pace, should I say. So I'm sceptical about the sprint. I remain such. If someone had to go and say to me, right, sprint's got to stay forever or go forever, I would err on the side of going. But I think it can be great, or it can at least be better, but I don't see it being like that, because I don't see F1 and the powers that be making it such.
Yeah, my opinion hasn't changed. I don't see the point of it. Genuinely, it's just I can't find any reason to get on board with it. It's an extra gimmick, which is just to try and increase the attention of our attentionless generation that we are a part of. Like Tom said, it's not a sprint. It's more like if they just call it the F1 light jog, that might actually describe it more aptly. A third of a race distance is not a sprint. It is literally like a gentle stroll.
But then if they call it a race.
That's the thing. Yeah, you can't call it a race. You can't call it a gentle stroll, because then you get accused of nepotism because Lance Stroll. It's you can't really do anything with it. The one gripe I have with the sprint, and it reared its head again with this one, is it gives any driver who's had a poor qualifying a chance to make amends before the race even starts, and it takes away the jeopardy of qualifying being really on the limit, really having to be that time where you deliver your ultimate lap. The example being Sergio Perez came 13th in qualifying. He didn't come 13th. He got demoted to 13th because his best times got deleted because of track limits violations. But at the same time, he starts 13th. And I'm sorry, but whatever you may say, in my opinion, the race is more interesting if you got Sergio Perez fighting through from 13th place, and it means that he has to try and fight tooth and nail to get a good result. In the end, it didn't really matter as much because, he got punted off by George Russell, although there was a collision between them and his race was ruined anyway. But the race is more interesting if he has to come through from 13th and try and rescue a result. But sprint means that he can go, you know what, I'm just going to drive past all these fast cars, these Alfa Romeos, these Hasses, these Alpines. They mean nothing to me, and I'm going to get my starting position of 5th back. It just gives him almost like a leg up, like a way to sort of get back in the action. And yes, I get it can provide the opposite. It can provide a sense of jeopardy. For example, Fernando Alonso would have started comfortably in the top 10, but because his car decided it didn't fancy starting that day, and it just decided to have problems with the electrics, he ended up starting from the pit lane instead. Now I get there's that sense of jeopardy, but for me it just doesn't add anything. It's just an extra thing for this attention-seeking or attention-needing younger generation to have something on a Saturday. There's nothing wrong with having practice on a Friday, It's not the most exciting, I'll admit. And they could have less practice sessions, but it happens, practice happens. You need to practice for these things, these important things in life, such as a Grand Prix weekend. Qualifying on a Saturday, race on a Sunday, works well. There's a reason why it's called a Grand Prix, because I'm loosely translating it here, but it's a big old race. It's a big old race, and it means that if you win one of them, it's a big achievement. You're telling me Esteban Ocon wasn't absolutely ecstatic when he won his first Grand Prix last year? He was over the moon because he realised his ambition to win a Grand Prix. I'm sorry, you're not getting the same buzz if you win a sprint. Stefano Domenicali and those in the F1 hierarchy have said that feedback from fans on sprint is hugely positive. Where? Show me this feedback. Tell me, where is this feedback coming from? The only thing you could argue would be it provides more action on a Friday. Qualifying late on a Friday would appeal to some people coming in after work. But you know what appeals to me? Qualifying on a weekend because I'm not busy, stuff like that. But at the same time, I still think they're going to persist, because if you bring something in and you want to give it a chance, you persist, right? You don't give up at the sign of adversity. So I think that's what F1's going to do, to be honest. And there's plans supposedly to expand the number of sprint events to 6 next year, which would be a quarter of the calendar. I don't like that at all. I'm opposed to it, but it's going to happen anyway. So I'm just going to have to accept it and swallow it, aren't I? Even if I and others oppose this concept. And you may be able to tell right now, I'm not going to be very easily persuaded the other way. I'm not convinced it adds much at all to the F1 weekend. It gives you a few points, a few little treats, a few extra points, but yeah, not for me. Still, not for me.
That's interesting, and it's a shame that we're so negative against it, because it has a lot of potential, and I'm far less conservative when it comes to F1 change than I think you are, Angus. And I know that there is a real split within the community, and I'd love to hear your thoughts at home, listeners, about whether or not you are opposed to sprints or not. And also, when you started watching F1, that would be a really interesting thing to track, whether or not long-term viewers of Formula One are more resistive to the change. But the fact is, sprint races have the opportunity to bring excitement and difference to a weekend of racing, and we know this because of Formula 2. If you don't know, there's a sprint race and a feature race, and in Formula 2 they reverse the front of the grid to make it more interesting. And you might say, well, how does that solve the problem? And the reason it might solve the problem in sprint to make it more interesting is because it's one thing to catch a car, it's a very different one to overtake. And people like Fernando Alonso, or in Austria, Mick Schumacher, have the ability to make it very, very difficult for the faster car to get past them. So, my suggestion to fix sprints is you have qualifying on Friday. Okay, I know you, Angus, you don't like it, but just hear me out. Friday qualifying. Whoever is in front for qualifying gets to go at the front for the Grand Prix. Then, what you do is 6 times a year, you basically give the chance for the back markers to get to the front, because being at the front gives you a massive advantage. Just being able to get through the pack gives you quite an advantage. And so, you do reverse the grid, or have some sort of reverse the grid. Maybe the front 10 reverse. I don't know. A reversing system. And therefore, what you do is you give 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 points for the top 8, or maybe 10 points for first and down to 1 point for 10th. I think it should be a limited amount of points. And then you set them off for a short sprint, literally 10 laps, or let's say 15 minutes of racing, okay? 15 minutes or so of racing. That means the back markers are fighting at the front for the race win, 10 points, and then we have a reverse grid in such a way that the faster cars, as you go down the grid, are defending the fastest cars at the back, with people like Fernando Alonso having the opportunity to get those extra points, and people like Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen having to fight through to try and get a point, because this matters now, because they might only be able to get 2 or 3 points. And then as a result, on the Saturday, you would have a much better melee of cars, 5 cars fighting, because the mid pack and the back of the pack is much, much closer often in Formula 1 than the very front. And so throwing the front into the mid could be really, really interesting. And then you get something out of it. You get some change, which is the best possible result, I think, because you would end up giving the back markers and the midfielders the chance to get some good points. The front runners aren't losing that many points because it's only 6 times a year, and realistically, they could only get maximum of 10 points anyway, or maybe 8 points if you didn't want it to be quite that many. And so you would interject a new level of Formula 1, something different. The problem I had with the race in Austria, and I'm not allowed to call it a race, am I? And the problem I have with the sprint in Austria is it felt like a preview for what we were going to get on Sunday. And I know that if you're a fan of sprints, you'll be sitting there going, well, actually, Tristan, Max Verstappen wasn't very good on the Sunday, and Ferrari were brilliant. Well, that's very true, but that's not actually reflective of many of the other sprint races, is it now, Greg? Such as Silverstone last year, when we had Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton fighting for on the first lap in the sprint, and then what happened again? They were fighting on the first lap of the actual Grand Prix. So yes, we're going to have 6 sprints next year, and I'm not sure I trust Democali to actually select the correct tracks, given that we're apparently going to have a sprint this year at Monza, which I don't know how I feel about that, because Monza's not actually that brilliant for overtaking. I don't know. They still haven't got rid of the sausage curb, so maybe that'll inject some interest into Monza a bit more. But I think if we're going to go forward and we're going to have sprints, we've got to give the race or the sprint a unique element that differentiates itself from the overall spectacle on Sunday. It cannot just be a little Grand Prix.
Yeah, I have to agree, and I find it baffling in many ways that with these new regulations where cars can more easily follow one another, there's still the argument from the powers that be that it would be dangerous somehow to have the slower cars at the front of the grid and the quicker cars behind them. It just really washed with me. And also as well, with your system, Tristan, I hadn't really thought of it before, but by having the switch around in some capacity, it's actually a great chance for research and development, because if you then have the slowest cars at the front not having to dodge and weave around blue flags and to, be so far away from, or be so close to everyone trying to catch up, should I say. You get them running in clean air, you get some more data there about how they perform, let's say at power circuits, hopefully where sprints are going to be held. Vice versa, switch that round. You've got Red Bull and Ferrari and Mercedes and the bigger teams that normally have less overtaking to do. You see how they run in terms of how they run in dirty air and overtaking many different cars and drivers throughout the track. So there's a research element to that as well, which would be quite useful. But the core issue you say there of it being a mini Grand Prix, I completely understand where you're coming from. But if I was playing devil's advocate and being a member of the powers that be, I'd say, well, it's kind of meant to be a mini Grand Prix because that's the way we get new viewers in, new people who are interested in Formula 1. We go, you really enjoyed the sprint, right? Well, here's a bigger version of it type thing. It's sort of a gateway into the sport. So I guess their argument would be that switching it round doesn't provide a gateway as such. But I think it's got some legs.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it. That is all.
I'm not sure that's an argument, but I disagree fundamentally that F1 has a problem with viewing Grand Prix and stuff, because if you want to watch a short version of the Grand Prix, you can go onto YouTube and watch the 8-minute highlights. In the UK, you can watch Channel 4's 1 hour total coverage of it, or in fact Sky, I believe, have a shortened highlight version as well. So there is certainly options out there. And I love qualifying and I think qualifying is sometimes lost on people, especially when they first get into the sport. Maybe you skip practice, you skip qualifying, you just watch the Grand Prix. But qualifying is a fantastic part, an element of Formula 1, because it's effectively a time trial where the only person they're up against is kind of themselves. Everyone tries to get clean air, and everyone just gets them a race against a clock. And I feel like that's a real unique part of qualifying, and that's why it's so interesting, because to some extent qualifying itself is a sprint race. If the whole idea of the sprint race is to determine who should be at the front by whoever is quickest overall, then I'd argue that's exactly what qualifying is. If you think about it, if you reduce it down to its basic element, it's whoever's fastest overall competing against everyone else on their raw time. And so the sprint race is basically just qualifying, except you have to do continuous laps. The Max Verstappen punching in a 0.3 of a second fastest lap in qualifying to take P1 is no different than Max Verstappen taking a 0.3 of a second fastest lap during a little sprint qualifying over 10 laps to be 3 seconds ahead. It all means the same thing. So this is my problem with sprint, is they haven't got anything that differentiates itself, and that's why I think they should mix up the grid. F1, if you're listening, our email's there. You can contact us for further details on our amazing plan to try and fit with your version of Formula 1 in the future.
Yeah, I did leave Austria or the sprint from it a bit disappointed, because I thought, well, Austria is a great circuit where there's lots of opportunities to overtake. This should be where the sprint really flies, but it didn't in my mind, really. Like, you had this sort of classic fight at the start with who's going to get the lead, and then I suppose the Ferrari scrapping for P2 and 3 didn't really help it. So I suppose if you were anti-sprint, not looking at anyone in particular, you'd look at this and go, well, it can't work. But I think it can, but I don't, as I say, I'm not convinced that Formula 1 is going to change it in such a fashion where it will work for the majority. And we go next to the French Grand Prix, Circuit Paul Ricard, if you will, the circuit with 167 combinations. Now, we're running out of time, but that is the next Grand Prix, so who do we think is going to do well there? Who needs to do well as well?
Who needs to do well? Aston Martin. They featured heavily in this podcast, but I promise you they're not sponsored by... They probably don't want to be sponsored by us, actually, at this point. But I think Mercedes have said that the best is yet to come and that big upgrades are coming from the French Grand Prix. So I'm going to say that Mercedes is going to do very well at the French Grand Prix. They're not in my F1 fantasy team, so inevitably that is a prediction that's going to come true. I think that Ferrari have to do well here if they want to keep in contention with the Constructors' Championship, Leclerc specifically for the Drivers' Championship. I think they need to get their head into the game and basically compromise Sainz to get Leclerc over the line and maximise their points and maximise their potential. Listen to our previous podcast if you want to hear our thoughts on Ferrari's game so far. And I think Haas as well. I think Haas have an opportunity to extend their lead for 7th, get closer to the 6th. And on a personal note, as a big McLaren fan, I would like McLaren to do well. And given that Paul Ricard is traditionally a track that's hard to overtake at because cars couldn't follow, these new regulations means cars should be able to follow well. We've seen that, and therefore the Grand Prix should be, hopefully, fingers crossed, quite exciting. So yeah, I think it would be nice to see McLaren, and Ricciardo doing very well, but specifically as well, Ferrari and Mercedes are going to be up there.
I've indeed also heard word on the grapevine being Formula1.com, that Mercedes could do well at this circuit. They could do well. They're mainly being linked to the fact that Paul Ricard, a la Silverstone, has very smooth surface, has very smooth tarmac, so that lends itself better to a car which struggles when the going gets tough or it starts being bumpy. With their porpoising issues. So I look at the track itself and it's not quite like Silverstone in terms of layout. I mean, there's some fast corners there, yes, for sure, but there's more sort of slower in nature. So I wouldn't say it would be as strong for Mercedes as Silverstone was, but I think we can definitely expect an upturn in performance from them. I'm expecting also, I think it's tradition before you go to a race to big up anyone who has a home race, and on this occasion it's Alpine and Mr. Ocon as well, and also Pierre Gasly, all have their home race, so we could see some strong performances from them. Alpine on a good run of form at the moment, closing up that gap to be level with McLaren for 4th in the Constructors. And yeah, perhaps even, I think that, to be honest, we talk about all those battles, the main thing we'll be looking out for is where's the pendulum, the momentum going to swing next? Will it be in the favour of Red Bull? Will it be in the favour of Ferrari? Will Verstappen fight back? Will Leclerc consolidate his advantage that he gained back in Austria? That will be possibly the biggest talking point of the weekend. But for a track which, I think you've been generous there, Tristan. I'm not convinced it usually brings exciting racing or has the potential to, but hopefully it does so this weekend and it enables an exciting race for all of us.
A team that needs to do well, a driver that needs to do well, that would be Pierre Gasly and AlphaTauri. They are currently on an absolutely stinker of a run. The last time either of them scored points was in Baku, a commendable P5, but since then they've either retired or been as high as P14. So some big noise needs to be coming out of AlphaTauri, and they need to be turning up the volume there for sure. And I think really when it comes to Ferrari and Red Bull, I think we will see Red Bull strike back and potentially win this race. But I think if you're Ferrari, you need to at least get both your drivers on the podium in some capacity or another, because if they don't do that or don't win the race, then I think that they've got quite the mountain to climb, really. Going to Hungary, I think there's going to be a circuit that will favour Red Bull, so it's time for them to go and make sure their momentum is less fragile, built more on concrete than sand. But yeah, also eyes on AlphaTauri, as I say, because they were very close to being mentioned in this episode by yours truly, but I thought, no, hang on. Give them a chance in France, but it's not looking great for them for sure. So it seems that's all we have time for in terms of episode 21 of F1 in Review. Thank you very much for listening all the way to the end of this one, be it on your preferred podcast provider or River Radio, be that live or via the listen back feature. A reminder, you can follow myself, Tristan, and the F1 in Review account on Twitter. If you're looking for the F1 in Review account, it's just like that, no hyphens, no nothing, all one word. And as we say, we turn next to round 12, the French Grand Prix. Qualifying is 3 p.m, that's British summertime on the Saturday, and the race is 1 hour earlier, that's 2 p.m, British summertime as well on the Sunday. And on a sad personal note, you will have a break from me. I will not be here next episode. I will be in sunny Spain, but you'll be left in very capable hands, and hopefully with less white noise for you to dissect throughout the episode. So I'll be seeing you in 2 weeks' time, and me, Pierre, will be looking after you come next week. Until next time, thank you very much for listening.